also known as Geolibertarianism. Georgism is an interesting heterodox philosophy from the late 19th century, which I think could actually be increasingly relevant in the modern world. And I think Henry George is actually one of the underrated economists out there. He wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, which really summarizes his economic theory. And his main concern really is the distribution of economic rent and how landowners are disproportionately gaining from the benefits of economic growth. We can see this example living in a city such as San Francisco. San Francisco has experienced a lot of economic growth, say, especially from 2009 to 2020, due to the influx of Web 2.0 and the related startups and the emergence of big tech companies and the high pay wages. However, the problem is that even though incomes in the San Francisco Bay Area skyrocketed as a result of all these high paying jobs, rents and property prices increased a lot more. So the biggest winner from the tech boom in the Bay Area was not really outside of a few founders with high concentrated share positions, were not the workers building these new technologies, but the landowners who were renting out or selling these properties to the new inflows of people. And Henry George saw this even when he lived in early 19th century San Francisco, which had its own issues with land shortage, and saw how disproportionate gains of the city were really just going to elite landowners. And as a result, his policy really solution was to replace all the existing tax framework with a single land tax. And the single land tax would be a tax that would basically tax the economic gains of just holding raw, undeveloped land. So like, say for example, if you own a piece of land in a desirable area and you're not using it or using it as a vacation home, you're going to pay a fairly high tax on that. However, if you convert it into something of more economic use, such as like an apartment building or an office building or a factory or whatever, you don't pay any taxes on the improvements like you do with a modern property tax. You just pay the equivalent of the society's economic cost of having it just sit there as vacant, unused land or for just personal consumption. And so what this does is two things. One, it mainly becomes a discourager of land speculation. If people can't make money just sitting on a property and having it go up because of some policy trend or people moving to a certain neighborhood or just sitting and collecting rents without any improvements, then people are less likely to do that and invest their capital dollars in things that generate returns. Or if they do buy properties, they'll buy properties to make capital improvements to improve the productivity of the region. The second benefit of this single tax is it makes owner occupying more affordable than it would be otherwise, because you have less bids for land speculators. And because there's a relatively high property tax, it doesn't make sense for people to own multiple properties. Whereas instead you have the landowners who live there can just buy a property at a much lower price due to the tax changing the demand component of property markets. And in theory, this would work fairly well because you wouldn't need income tax. So sure, your property taxes would be higher in this system, but say a property tax is 5% and you make $125,000 a year, which would put you, say, for this example, I think in the 25% tax bracket. Actually, make the math easier. 100,000, you make 100,000 a year, you're in the 20% tax bracket. And if you live in California, you're in the 29% tax bracket for this example. But, and yet your property tax, instead of 1% on your $500,000 house, would now be 3% or 4%. So you're paying now, instead of $5,000 a year, you're paying $20,000 a year, but you're not paying any income tax. So you're still better off, or at worst, break even, except you're still better off because you're not paying property tax, but you're paying the same as you would have paid in income tax in this new single tax. And so that is the idea of Georgism, essentially, is that landowners who effectively get the most benefit from the state, because that's the reason why their property is worth more than living in a government that is more dysfunctional, and they provide the national defense to protect your property, the police to enforce your property rights, they build the roads and the infrastructure so people can access your property and it's livable. And that's a lot that is mostly done by government. So really, shouldn't the landowners be the ones paying for it? Under Georgism, they would. The main real critiques of it is, one, it really hasn't been tried outside of a few colonial outputs in Asia in the 19th century. It seemed to have actually a decent amount of success in those parts of the world. The other thing is, a lot of people preferred Marxism because Marxism was more politically popular because it had a more of a retribution and punishing effect on the quote-unquote rich, and people like the eat the rich political rhetoric, which though income tax is a far stronger sale of it. The other critique is that even if the Georgist policy was there, it would keep real estate prices relatively low. So people who like to make their money in real estate would have a harder time doing that, as well as it would restrict the growth of the size of the government, because if you have property prices stay relatively constant, adjusted for inflation, and your property tax rate doesn't change that much over time, then it's very hard to grow revenue, and so your revenue is more capped. Whereas you have an income tax, you can raise the tax rates easier, and on top of that, even if you don't, you can inflate your way out of your debt and use bracket creep to increase your revenues. So for governments, income tax is a much more way to increase revenue. But the other benefit of the George system is that it's a lot easier for tax compliance, because you can't really hide the fact that you own a property. You either own the property or you don't, and if you own the property, you have to pay a fixed tax. Property tax is the easiest correct. You can't just take your land with you across a border if you decide to move because taxes are too high. You have to pay tax on the property whether you live there or not, or it gets appropriated. So yeah, there's notable economists such as Robert Solow endorsed it. I'm just surprised that that it really hasn't caught on more. I think it's a really interesting idea that, especially in a world of increased real estate shortages, could be actually politically appealing to the right campaign.